Johnny Depp had a woman who was essentially his broker. And so Depp goes to her to say, hey, rustle up some investors. We ended up having a meeting at Vipe Room. Now, it was big on Thursday nights. It was, a halfway decent nightclub on Friday and Saturdays. All they did was push money through. And much of that was actually proceeds coming out of a duffel bag. Within the cartel structure, every cartel has their money laundering wing. Mm-hmm. And these are essentially professionals who have nothing to do with the product whatsoever.
Right. They're just money management.
Yeah, it's money guys. And up until about 5 years ago, that was basically controlled in-house or contracted with professionals operating mainly out of the Mexican city of Guadalajara. Guadalajara is the money laundering capital for the Western Hemisphere, if not for the world. And they literally have hundreds of millions of dollars, if not about $1 billion, every month in cash coming down.
How did that get to be that? I mean, like, why there? What was the origin there?
Well, the origin is actually very interesting. And after Mexico won independence in 1810, and remember, we're talking Mexico was enormous at the time. It's right. All of California, all of Texas, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, into Utah and into Colorado. The newly independent country of Mexico needed to populate its territory. So they spent about 10 years in Europe trying to encourage immigration to Mexico. Not very successful. So what you essentially had was two classes of individuals: the Spanish descendants, which are like the rich, landed gentry, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then you had the peasants, indigenous Indians that weren't slaughtered, essentially. Well, the first country that Mexico entered into a relationship with for the purposes of bringing people to its country, to Mexico, was China in 1820. And so between 1820 and 1920, you had several waves of Chinese immigration. Mm-hmm. And by the turn of the 20th century, the second largest demographic in Mexico were Chinese nationals. And with the Chinese came the practice of smoking opium. Mm-hmm. They brought the seeds. And so that's where you had the first narcos in Mexico were Chinese.
Right.
Of course, at the time, it wasn't illegal. Mm-hmm. Whole bunch of machinations. And like through pure chance, you had about a half a dozen of these Chinese communities up and down the Mexican Pacific coast, stretching from present-day San Francisco and California all the way down to Acapulco. And all of them were opium smokers. Unfortunately for nearly all of the Chinese communities, and we're not talking big communities, think 600 people, 700 people, 1,000. Like San Francisco was the biggest. And the land and the climate is unsuitable for growing poppy in nearly all of them. The one community that landed in present-day Mexico, you had about 3 of them, one around Ensenada, one in Mexican state of Sinaloa, and one in the Mexican state of Guerrero, which is Acapulco. All of these are Pacific states. The climate in Sinaloa was the one that was perfect for cultivating opium. Mm. And so the genesis, the cradle of opium production has always been the Mexican state of Sinaloa. And the Chinese in Sinaloa were growing it for themselves, and then they had to grow it for the other Chinese communities. Well, things changed in 1850s because morphine was identified as an opiate derivative. And for the next 100 years, morphine was primarily the pain medication. Mm-hmm. You had 15 million casualties from the Civil War that were able to live with the pain. Their pain management protocol was morphine. Well, the only place on North America where you can get the opium was Sinaloa. So the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico, the American pharmaceutical industry, was built on the backs of the Chinese narcos growing opium in Sinaloa.
Okay.
And so from there, it just continued to where the fact that, in 1914, we'll skip a century. In 1914, the American government restricted the sale of opium and its derivatives, morphine and then heroin. Well, by then, the Chinese were the second largest ethnic demographic in Mexico. they had accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth. Well, in the 1920s, there was a lot of pushback against the Chinese because they had essentially locked in a bunch of industries. When they came over, they started the agricultural industry. They started the fishery industry. When America when America took the Pacific coast from the Mexicans in 1848, the very next year, 1849, gold was discovered in California. That's what prompted the migration. Well, those people from the East Coast didn't come to California to build cities. They didn't come to work in saloons or in barbershops. They wanted to go up in the mountains and strike it rich, just north of San Francisco, up in the Sierra Nevada.
Right.
So they had to import additional Chinese workers. So essentially, the Chinese built San Francisco and a number of the other cities on the Pacific coast. Well, there was a tremendous amount of pushback in Mexico, and essentially what you had was a xenophobic reaction that provided cover. The Mexican businessmen that were coveting the Chinese wealth were able to steal the Chinese businesses. The Mexican gangsters that were coveting the Chinese heroin production were able to steal that. So this is where you get the association between Los Angeles, because at the time, Bugsy Siegel in the 40s was running things in LA.
Right.
In the 20s and 30s, Mickey Cohen was.
Right.
Well, Mickey Cohen was getting his product out of Guadalajara because it was grown in Sinaloa, but it was being distributed out of Guadalajara. And then when the Chinese suffered their mass expropriation of wealth, those that weren't deported, and 75% of them got deported back to China. These are people who never even lived in China. They just all got kicked out of the country. And those that weren't deported, a group of them settled in Guadalajara, and they're the ones that maintained business ties with the new Mexican gangsters that were controlling opium, because there was still the opium markets for the Chinese. So so you had essentially an infrastructure begin in the 1920s in Guadalajara, where opium up and down the West Coast, and in particular its derivative heroin, were now being ran out of that city. So now you had to start at that early point money laundering. And by the time the 1960s rolled around, you had what was called the formation of an organization that went on to become known as the Guadalajara Cartel. And the Guadalajara Cartel is actually a little bit of a misnomer because the men that ran it were all from Sinaloa. But these were marijuana cultivators, enormous cultivation operations. Because in addition to being able to grow poppy, it's also very conducive, Sinaloa is, for growing weed, the state of Sinaloa and the surrounding states. It's what's called the Golden Triangle in Mexico.
Right. I've heard of the Golden Triad, yeah.
Well, there was an issue where the Mexican drug traffickers were generating so much money in Sinaloa, and everybody in Sinaloa was getting a piece. The entire state was essentially built on the back of opium and marijuana. The ports, the roads, the markets in Culiacan, the markets in Monchi, Mazatlan. And so everybody in the state was getting a piece, from the governor on down. Well, federal authorities wanted to get in on this action.
Of course.
So they essentially came in, wiped out many of the local, the old guard, essentially. Those that weren't killed fled to Guadalajara. And then they entered into a new arrangement with the federal authorities. So this is how the name Guadalajara Cartel became. It was Sinaloa guys who fled what was called Operation Condor, ended up in Guadalajara. It's a much bigger city, much more sophisticated than, Sinaloa is actually, other than the drug trafficking, very poor.
Right.
And so here you had a sophisticated cosmopolitan city with a lot of banking infrastructure and close relationships with the new military overlords. Because in Mexico, these organizations are able to exist only because the corruption permits them to do so. Okay. And so this all started with Guadalajara because back in the 70s, these concentrations of wealth started coming in from the cultivation and distribution of marijuana. You had an enormous explosion in the United States with the whole hippie thing, 60s and 70s. So an enormous increase in consumption. The demand was enormous. So they generated a tremendous amount of money, brought it down to Guadalajara. In the 80s, here comes the Colombians. They need their product transshipped into the United States. So now they're just dealing directly with the guys out of Guadalajara. So essentially, it just builds into this circumstance where you had successive waves, whether it was initially with the marijuana, then with the blow, then with the synthetics. All of that was ran out of Jalisco, right there. Guadalajara is its capital. Then now with Feni, this is with the new generation cartel, again, based out of Guadalajara. And so it's just essentially been the one piece of the pie in which everything has been organized around.
Okay. So take us back, like what was the methods in the early days, and then kind of walk us forward. Has much changed? I mean, you would think with the advent of technology, I'm sure there's been some, but let's kind of work our way from how they used to be back then to now, and what's the biggest change?
Well, let's just front load it really quick. The biggest change, and I say it this way because by doing it this way, we'll be able to appreciate just how significant the change is.
Right.
Well, in the last 5 years, underground banking networks associated with Chinese triads have essentially taken over money laundering. I'm talking at this point, they're at maybe 75%. And it has created a circumstance where federal law enforcement authorities in the United States are just absolutely gripped with panic because the system is absolutely impenetrable. And it's in conjunction with, specific cultural characteristics of Chinese culture in conjunction with modern technology. Today, they're able to communicate. They're using WeChat, which is an encrypted chat platform that's out of China. So I don't believe the notion that the FBI can intercept it. The problem is the money brokers in LA are using burner phones.
Right.
And it's just, nondescript statements like, hey, yeah, I bought the, I bought my, the engagement ring for my fiance.
Yeah.
That could be the signal for I picked up the cash. Like, it's at this point.
And then they toss the phones, and there's essentially
they toss the phone.
By the time you would even get close to being able to get a wiretap or get involved with the phone, they're done tossed and got a new one.
They're not just that. You have to understand that, and ultimately, what we're going to build up to is what are called mirror transactions, which aren't new because there were mirror transactions at issue in the drug conspiracies for which I was prosecuted back in the late 1990s. But what is new is the fact that the money is going from the United States to China to Mexico. And there's no actual movement of cash. Therefore, it's completely outside of the regulated financial system. And so a circumstance has now been presented, unlike in the old days, where we had to actually take risks.
Yeah.
You literally filled up a car full of cash and filled up a trunk of a Toyota Camry and drove down to the border. You get pulled over, you get knocked off. All of a sudden, they come up on the money. There's risks associated with transportation. There's risks associated with getting ripped off. There's infrastructure. You got to maintain an entire network of stash houses all over Los Angeles. Like each one of the 4 principal cartel organizations that were based in LA had its own money laundering wing, which was essentially coordinating the pickups of cars from all over the United States. You got a car from Cincinnati with 300 grand, a car from Milwaukee with 600 grand, a car from Minneapolis with 2 minutes. Every day, cars arriving.
Jeez.
It's just an enormous operation where you have to have redundancies, where you've got the initial point of deliveries. Then the first couriers don't know where the main stash house is, so he's got to take it to a cutout apartment. Then it's got to get counted, segregated into different denominations. Then you got to figure out, okay, well, how's the money going to get moved? Is this going to Colombia? Is this going to Mexico? Is this going to pay off American workers? So it's just an enormous operation that, because the Chinese have stepped in, they've essentially obviated that. At this point, there are Chinese cells in Los Angeles that are traveling all over the United States to just pick up the cash at the location. So you're not even taking it from Chicago to LA. They'll just send the Chinese guy to Chicago, pick it up. So it has completely revolutionized how money laundering is taking place in Mexico and here in the United States with respect to the cartels. Now, with respect to my era, it was simply bulk cash transports to the border or trade-based money laundering systems to get the money from the United States down to Colombia. Okay. Later on, when the Mexicans took over, they incorporated trade-based money laundering to get their money to Mexico, because there's a difference between money in a duffel bag and money in a bank account.
Mm-hmm.
You need the money in the duffel bag for operating expenses, but it's very risky.
Yes.
And so the trade-based money laundering systems that were operating in Los Angeles, initially for the Colombians and then for the Mexicans, were designed to allow for the transfer of value. When people think about LA, you don't think about it as being the money laundering capital of the United States. They think about Hollywood, they think about the entertainment industry, they think about Disneyland. Well, Los Angeles has the two biggest ports on the West Coast. It is the trucking capital of the United States. It is one of the largest train hubs in the United States. It is a transportation center. So it's enormously convenient to move product all over the country via tractor trailers. Move money back to Los Angeles, either for cars with compartments or, again, with tractor trailers. And so in my era, it was essentially collect the cash in LA, run it down to the border, or run it through the businesses in LA, because in addition to being the largest transportation hub in the United States, Los Angeles has the largest fashion district in the world. Mm-hmm. It also has the largest jewelry market in the world. Well, we've had numerous large-scale money laundering prosecutions about once a decade. You'll get a massive case. Like there was one in the 2010s where they recovered like $93 million out of a t-shirt company. They got like $100 million out of a number of other places associated with clothing companies. Well, this happens about once a decade. It's happened in the 90s.
When they say when they got this, they just found buildings that had the name of that business on it, but the cash was there. How does that happen?
Well, generally what happens is somebody on the inside will get in trouble, tip off the authorities. Because, here in the United States, any financial transaction that occurs over $10,000 is supposed to get reported.
Yes.
And so what they'll do is they'll bring the money to Los Angeles and they'll purchase $9,000 increments of t-shirts, socks, any garments that are being produced in the garment district. They import it to Mexico. Or export it to Mexico. Well, in Mexico, they simply sell the goods.
Yeah.
So now they can establish the provenance of where the money came from. It came from the sale of clothing. It came from the sale of electronic goods.
Okay.
It's not surfacing the capital in Mexico. It's surfacing the capital in the United States through the fashion district, through the jewelry market. Operation Pisces in the 90s, one of the biggest money laundering investigations happened in the fashion district, in the jewelry market. We've had 3 of them in the last 30 years in the fashion district. And so this was the way that the Mexicans were able to move items of commercial value to Mexico that they could then sell to recoup the money.
Are they selling it for about what they have in it? Or are they having to take a loss on that? Or?
Well, look, the purpose of money laundering is to surface the capital. Mm-hmm. Which is why you're able to engage in financial transactions that, under scrutiny, don't make business sense. Mm-hmm. However, and the companies that the organizations that are focusing on money laundering generally were charging anywhere from 8 to 9%. And then when you add on top of that the administrative costs, you're talking, they're spending 11 to 12% back in the 1990s. To surface capital through trade-based money laundering operations.
Right.
Today, it's 1% with the Chinese. There's a case now that recently was completed where it was 0.5%. 0.5% is what the Chinese are charging.
And is that just because the volume is so heavy now?
No. Okay, well, here's the thing. In 2015, China had a financial crisis,
right,
which prompted a lot of capital flight out of the country. So the government of China had to dip into its foreign currency reserves to prop up its currency, which we'll just refer to as the RMB. Mm-hmm. Well, in order to save they maintain the RMB in a certain trading range with the American dollar,
right?
And so in order to prop that up, they had to dip into $1.5 trillion of their foreign currency reserves. On top of that, between 2015 and 2016, you had $1 trillion worth of capital flight. These are wealthy Chinese individuals who want dollars in the United States. Remember, you understand, last year, China created twice as many billionaires as the United States did, like 240. There are literally an enormous swath of very wealthy individuals now in China. They send their kids to Stanford. They send their kids to Harvard. Well, Stanford costs more than $50,000 a year.
Yeah.
Well, the Chinese government in 2017 implemented capital controls. No Chinese national is allowed to move more than $50,000 out of China without getting pre-clearance from the government. So that means if you're a rich Chinese guy who wants to invest his money in the American equity markets, he can only move 50,000.
Mm-hmm.
These guys want to all maintain second homes, like, escape hatches. That's their parachute. The Chinese are buying up property in Los Angeles, driving up prices in San Francisco, driving up prices in Seattle. They've got like a third of Vancouver. And so they need to be able to get dollars to the United States to either buy real estate, invest in equity markets, go on luxury trips, or pay for their kids' tuition. Well, with the $50,000 cap, they're not able to get enough money out of the country. So what the Chinese triads have done, have stepped in, and they're capitalizing on an 1,100-year-old system to facilitate the wealthy Chinese individuals to buy American dollars in the United States. Well, who has American dollars in the United States that are available for sale? Drug cartels.
Mm-hmm.
So $3 million to a Mexican national in Los Angeles is worth $4 million to the Chinese guy in China. And so what they're doing, the reason why the Chinese operatives in Southern California are able to charge 1% is because they're charging the rich Chinese individual 30%.
Okay, that makes sense.
Basically, the 1% in the United States is covering administrative costs. Like that's paying for their houses, their cars, their women. Like that's their pay. The 14K Triad, which has really stepped in to take over much of this, they're charging the guys on the Chinese end, like I said, 30%. So if they get, once the Chinese guy in LA meets with the Mexican guy and gets $3 million, the Chinese guy in LA sends an encrypted message on a burner phone to Shanghai or to Shenzhen or to Guangzhou, and the 14K office there lets the businessman know, say, hey, we got $3 million in LA. Do you want to buy it? We want $4 million here in the Chinese currency. Mm-hmm. Well, the rich Chinese guy pays the Chinese guy in China, the 14K Triad guy in China, $4 million. And his representative in LA will then pick up the $3 million in cash. So that's how they're able to circumvent the capital controls. Now, if you stop and think about it, the American government believes, it's estimated that the American drug market in total is $100 billion.
Jesus
It
Christ.
is believed that the Mexican cartels, principally the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, are generating $25 to $30 billion. The market for US dollars in China is $900 billion. Take 30 times the amount of money Sinaloa and the New Generation makes. That's how much demand there is in China for the dollars here in the United States. It's an insatiable demand. And it's been going on 17, 18, 19. The Chinese government's trying to stop capital flight. Well, they found a way around capital flight. And it's not just here in the United States. They're laundering money for the mafia in Italy, Yakuza in Japan. I mean, it's every Western nation whose currency is of value to a wealthy Chinese individual. Their markets are now in play.
And why is this so hard to stop? Like, why is the government getting a piece to not take it, or is it just too difficult?
As far as stop by on what end? On the American end?
Either
or the
one.
Chinese end?
Yeah, either one.
Well,
like
on the American,
if they know what they're doing, how are they not stopping them, or do they not want to stop them, or can't stop them? How are they allowing it to operate?
Well, first of all, well, look, I'm from Los Angeles, so that's my area of familiarity.
Right.
We had 4 triads operating in LA. There are 3 significant Asian communities.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they don't walk around with signs on them.
Right.
They own little restaurants. A little Chinese restaurant in Hacienda Heights is really a front for the 14K. Or, excuse me, at that point, it was Wo Hop To. A place down in Westminster in Orange County, that's a 14K bar.
Right.
Well, every establishment, many establishments serve as a front for what's referred to in Chinese as Feishin. Feishin is an 1,100-year-old system that allows for the transfer of value over long distances. Here in the United States, we've been very fortunate because not only are we a young country, but we were founded after modern banking was developed. That started in the Renaissance. We were founded just a few decades before the Industrial Revolution. So we've always had the benefit of modern systems. China, as of 50 years ago, was a third world nation.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the mid-1970s that they started introducing capitalist elements into Chinese economy. What you look at some of the cities, you look at Guangzhou today, it's just amazing. You got cities in China that, I'm an American. I love the United States. I love being an American. It's embarrassing that a country that was a third world nation 5 decades ago has cities that spectacular, and ours are decrepit and falling apart.
Yes, I agree with that.
But now, up until 50 years ago, what we today consider underground Chinese banking, to the Chinese was their banking. That's all they ever had for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So it's a culturally accepted manner in which to move money. Now, today in China, the wealth is concentrated along the East Coast. Well, once you go inland, hey, there are more Chinese living in poverty than there are American citizens. They don't have banks. They're still using Feishin. The Chinese diaspora is anywhere from 20 to 40 million Chinese living around the world outside of China. Most of them are young men that move in search, and they're poor guys from poverty villages, move for the purposes of getting, employment opportunities. So you've got millions of Chinese working in Africa, building freeways, building hospitals. They're in the Philippines building casinos. They're in Pakistan building highways. They're in Afghanistan building mines. Well, every week, they got to get part of their paycheck sent home to their families in the form of remittances. Right. It's still being used today by millions of Chinese all over the world. So this network is already in place. So it's not like they're creating something new. They just applied it in a new context.
Okay. And then the American side of things, I mean, we touched on this in the last episode that we did, and it's kind of been, shadowed in movies and things like that. But like, you run a lot of stuff through nightclubs, and the strip clubs are obviously very prominent for that kind of business, anything cash-based business. And you talked about a really cool little business venture that I'd never really heard of, was like a limousine company, because they don't really know how much time those limousines are rented out. I mean, they could, and what you're renting them out for. So you can essentially write your own ticket with those types.
Yeah, in the American context, a lot of the laundering is basically predicated upon phantom billing.
Right.
Whether it's, phony alcohol sales at a bar, phantom charters for boats.
Yes.
Phantom rentals for limos. That's, a fairly unsophisticated, but very effective.
Yes.
Way to surface capital. Like, I had a good friend of mine that was involved in laundering money through the music industry. Several of the guys that were distributors with respect to the product I'd issue in my case, one of whom was a relatively well-known producer associated with Death Row Records. Really? And so because of that tie-in, like, quite a bit of the money was getting laundered through the music industry. And that's essentially, but again, it's basic phantom sales. You're having CDs produced of very little known artists and then you claim it sold X number of copies. No, this really took off in the early 1990s because what you had was the demonstration by NWA, Ice Cube, DJ Quick. These were artists that achieved a significant level of commercial success without any commercial airplay. Like, you never heard NWA's "Fuck the Police" on the radio.
Yeah. And just as a side note, Matt Cox doesn't know anybody you just named.
Yes, I know. Yeah. And so it's and so you have albums that had 1 million sales without any of the objectively verifiable metrics that are normally utilized for the purposes of accounting. Like, if you have remember, we're talking back in the 90s also. It's not like today where the people are streaming on Spotify.
Yeah.
We're talking buying records, buying compact discs, buying cassette tapes. A lot of the rap guys started out by selling stuff at swap meets, selling their records at swap meets, selling them out of the trunks of their cars.
Yeah.
And so what it demonstrated was that there was an ability for unknown artists to achieve commercial success. See, if you're a regular artist on the Billboard Top 10, anybody auditing the books is going to know you're selling tens of thousands of records, if not more, a week.
Right.
But if you're a gangster rap artist who achieves commercial success, how do they measure that?
Right.
For all you, it's popular in the nightclubs. It's popular in the underground club scene. It's popular at college campuses. So you produce 50,000 copies of the compact disc, and you claim it's being sold at swap meets. This week, 3,500 got sold at the swap meets in LA. Next week, 4,500. 2 weeks later, 7,500. Hey, we got ourselves an underground banger. Let's order more copies.
Right.
You end up
an accident that could happen with that. And I only mentioned this because I heard this story today. I was watching an interview. Do you know the band Hootie and the Blowfish? You ever heard of them?
Sure.
Okay. So Darius Rucker, the lead singer, actually lives in the town I live in Charleston, South Carolina. Okay. That's where he's from. And he was telling a story about how they had that band for like 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they got noticed is because they had a song out. I forgot what the song was, but like, they would distribute their album to local record stores, and it would sell in the local markets. So when the Billboard magazines would call and say, we need your top 50 albums, they would see that these albums, especially in the Carolinas and, the South, was outselling like major artists. So that generated buzz until they got somebody to come look at them. Then they actually signed to, I think it was Atlantic Records. Then their big break was a studio in New York. Played their song. David Letterman heard it. Letterman had him on the Letterman show. They played Let Her Cry, and the rest was history. But talking about what you're talking about, if you could actually, if sales were actually done in the record stores, these guys could possibly get even shot up to stardom. But I know they're phantom sales, but it's kind of it just made me think of that story.
The way it was actually my roommate for a long time, and the way he was doing it was he would approach, any number of young guys that fancy themselves to be rappers.
Mm-hmm.
He'll put up the money for the album.
Yeah.
Look, if it's a success, great.
Yeah.
They're not just trying to tank it. This kid's rapping his heart out. They're paying for a producer to come in.
It benefits and it blows up, but if it doesn't, you've found a way to launder some money.
That was the genesis for several of the large record labels. Because I know some guys that put up money for record labels that ultimately became enormous. Well, initially it was just laundering. Then they struck gold.
Right.
And so with respect to my friend, he was actually, let's say he had, $75,000 tied up into getting 50,000 CDs pressed. You pay the artist, give him a one-time fee, plus he's going to get a back end of the sales. You pay the producer, he's going to get a back end of the sales and a one-time fee. Now, these guys are going to spend their time trying to go out there and gen up buzz and create interest. In the event they fail to succeed, at that point, it's not a loss. That's where those 50,000 remaining CDs get sold through the phantom sales.
Yeah.
And so it might take 4 months at 2,000 CDs here, 3,500 here. Remember, most of them are being sold in swap meets. So every week, the young woman that's the secretary at the record club, she's going into the bank and depositing cash deposits because swap meet sales are all in cash.
Swap meets are cash. Yeah.
And so if you've got, let's say, $2.25 tied up into every CD and you're selling them for $12, you just made $9.75 profit in phantom sales.
Yeah.
So out of 50,000 CDs, you generate 600,000 in revenue. You just push through 495,000 in drug money. Meanwhile, you take those CDs, the ones that weren't sold, and they get dumped in the bay in Santa Monica. And then here comes the next artist, and here comes the next artist, and it's just continuously, look, I grew up listening to hip hop. I loved hip hop.
Yeah.
But hip hop in the gangster rap context became a gold mine for money laundering because it provided the opportunity to sponsor artists with the intention of expecting no sales. These are, again, another instance where you're engaging in business where commercially it doesn't really make sense for you to do it. But on the other hand, there's an ulterior motive behind it, essentially.
Yeah. Like you could say, why are you taking a risk on that guy? He's not very good. Well, maybe he's not, but I mean, I know at least I'm going to get, this. Maybe we get this and this. Maybe we get both.
Maybe he gets lucky. If not, you're pushing through 500 G's of your drug money.
Yeah, and say you run through 10, 12 artists, you have 1 to 2 that are good. You've essentially started an umbrella on a label of some good artists, and you've been able to wash money with the other ones.
That's what happened with several very large record labels. They didn't even start out as being essentially they were built to launder.
Can you say which ones they were?
Huh?
Can you say which ones they were?
You got Slow Motion Records out of California, and you had Death Row out of California.
Wow.
In fact, I know the trafficker that put up the money for Death Row. Good friend of mine, Michael Harris.
I've heard it. Is he still in prison or he passed
Nope,
away now?
He sentence was commuted by Trump.
Really?
And he's home, and he is now the number 2 guy at Death Row.
Oh, so he went back to Death Row.
Yeah. Because when Suge Knight put it into bankruptcy.
Right. Snoop bought it, right?
Huh?
Snoop bought it, right?
Snoop bought it, yes.
Okay.
And so, I'm sure today it's
all that.
Huh?
What killed all that? Like what you were explaining here, what we just broke down, what stopped that?
It was going on at the time of my arrest. It didn't stop. Now, what changed was in 93 with the success of The Chronic. Because now you had the first quote unquote gangster rap album that achieved commercial success with commercial airplay.
Mm-hmm.
Their videos were on MTV. Their songs were all over the radio.
So that limits how much you can.
Well, on the one hand, it expanded it because it allowed for a bigger pool. But on the other hand, it introduced a level of professionalism because now you had actual labels wanting to control the artists rather than independent guys saying, I'll put up the money.
Yeah. Okay.
And so look, as of 97, when I got taken to the Federal Detention Center, this was still going rampant.
Well, I mean, it's linked to even the guy who's went in the news recently this week. I don't know if you're familiar, but BMF, Big Meech, actually just got out of jail. He had a 30-year sentence. I think he's a couple years earlier. He's got to do some of it in a halfway house, but he is out of prison right now.
Got about 16 months in the halfway house. He was with me at Coleman.
Really? You were locked up with Big Meech? Okay. And so his brother got out, I think, 2 years ago. They both got 30-year sentences. His brother got out, I think, 2 years ago.
Sure. Well, you for a non-violent drug offender, the system has changed quite a bit because normally you do 85% on your time. In 2019, legislation called the First Step Act took effect, and it allows for prisoners that are programming who are eligible to earn additional credits to earn up to 15 days off a month. And so that's how Big Meech was able to get out instead of in 26, pushing 27. He's now out now because he received 1 year off because of credits. He received 18 months of extended halfway house placement.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of doing, 26, he ends up doing 22.
Well, it is the point of me bringing those up, and to highlight the fact that he did get out early. It was said they bankrolled a lot of guys like Jeezy and a lot of the guys that come through that level. There was another guy named Blue Da Vinci.
Sure.
That was kind of I don't know if that was how they were washing money. I'm not educated enough on that subject to say that's exactly what they were doing, but that's been rumored that was being done in that camp.
I think they were actually invested in maintaining some sense of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Look, I don't like the stereotype, but particularly within the African-American drug trafficking community, there's a certain status to being a music producer.
Right.
And so it provides you not only with that status, but it also provides you with something that is credible for guys with little education to all of a sudden be living in Beverly Hills.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm saying? And so it's something that's plausible. They're not coming in saying they developed a new cell phone technology. They're saying, hey, look, we're producing hip hop artists. Okay. Well,
right. Makes sense. Makes money.
Sense. It's plausible. And so they get a double benefit. So when you're operating at that level, I don't think they were trying to so much launder money, particularly at the end when they were doing with Jeezy.
Right.
I'm sure at the beginning, this is how they were doing it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%.
But once you achieve a certain level of success, once the Chronic blew up at Death Row, like that summer, we were kind of told, like, hey, stop coming around.
Yeah. You're getting a lot of eyes on you now at that point.
What I mean? Because we got, like there'd be meetings held at the recording studio in Hollywood. Like one of the guys was one of the main distributors in my case. So we'd go there just to bullshit and talk to the guy. And it was like, hey, look, Time Warner wants to pay $100 million for this thing. Like no more dirt around the business.
Weren't you asked to be in a video?
Yes. I was asked to be in Gin and Juice.
Were you in it?
No.
I just found that funny. I can't wait when you talk about your.
They wanted me to be the police officer. Yeah.
How ironic.
Yeah.
There's a story that you talked about, and I'm kind of working on a little project with this, but the Viper Room, and this is obviously the case with a lot of clubs, especially in areas like LA, where it's going to be high end. There's going to be, if you can get that clientele of movie stars or whatever, all the better. But Johnny Depp owned the Viper Room, and you mentioned Mickey Cohen earlier. Like I think he owned that originally, like years and years and years ago.
Yeah.
It went through a few hands. It went through a few name changes. But Depp ultimately did wind up with it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were involved in a proposition where was he wanting you to be partners? Was he wanting you to buy it? What was that deal?
Here's the thing. When Depp opened the nightclub in August of 93.
Right.
And that was right at the center of the drug activity in my case.
Right.
And within a month of them opening the Viper Room, it was one of the hottest clubs in LA. And it achieved a level of success, mainly, look, that was the summer that Edward Scissorhands came out. Like that was the summer that Johnny Depp became a movie star.
Yeah.
Before he was a TV star, but he wasn't really a movie star. That summer, he went into the stratosphere.
Yeah.
And so him and his business partners bought this nightclub. And for you who haven't been to the Viper Room, it's small.
Yeah, I went to it for the first time last year. It was very small.
Very small. It's talking like, 400 people getting kind of crowded. It's less, put it this way, it's less than 500 people. I'd be shocked if it was more than 400 people.
Yeah.
But because of his star power, he was able to attract bands. Like the first time I went there was on the night of the MTV Music Awards, like right after the show, right over to the Viper Room because Pearl Jam was playing. Like I was a huge Pearl Jam fan. Well, at the time, Pearl Jam's selling out arenas. Meanwhile, they're playing this bar that holds 300 people.
Yeah.
And so he was able to attract that kind of level of, artists to perform there. Well, it was such an enormous level of, how can I say this? LA has a deep level of superficiality.
Yeah.
And, it's all status driven. And so it was the hot club and everybody wanted to be there. And so let's say Depp and his business partner dumped $500,000 into that place.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be surprised if they dumped more than that into getting that place up and running. A month after it opened, it's worth $20 million.
Right.
So a month before it opens, you can get 40% of that place for $200,000. A month after it's open, $200,000 gets you 1%. And so after the club enjoyed this meteoric level of success, Johnny Depp and his business partner decided that they wanted to cash out at the much higher valuation, not their entire piece, but sell percentages at the much higher valuation.
This wasn't Anthony Fox, was it?
Huh?
Well, it wasn't Anthony Fox that was with him.
I didn't meet the business partner. I only met Depp.
Okay.
And so Johnny Depp had a woman who was essentially his broker going around speaking to individuals. Now, her name was Victoria Sellers. She was the daughter of the great actor Peter Sellers.
Yep.
She was a former Playboy model who was best friends and business partners with Heidi Fleiss. Vicky hosted a party at a very upscale nightclub. No, not so much upscale, just much more exclusive. You were recently in Los Angeles. Well, at the Roxy, there was a nightclub at the top of the Roxy called On the Rocks back then.
Yeah.
She hosted the party at On the Rocks, which was essentially you're either an entertainment industry figure, a celebrity, or a drug trafficker, or you're not getting in. It's just dope dealers partying with any number of large movie stars and a lot of Playboy models. And so she knew a lot of people in the nightclub industry. More importantly, she knew every big drug dealer in LA. And so Depp goes to her to say, hey, rustle up some investors. Now, I'm not saying Depp knew we were drug traffickers.
Right.
He just knew we had capital to invest. And so we ended up having a meeting at another nightclub. In fact, it was a party hosted by Death Row Records at a nightclub on the Sunset Strip. It was actually a significant event in my case because my roommate invited the individual who turned out to have been a confidential informant. And so he brought the informant there so he was able to recount these events. And so, we had the meeting with Depp. And quite frankly, it wasn't something I was interested in. Like I was interested in getting involved in a nightclub. I just didn't want to get involved with it. First of all, it was small. Second of all, you're putting up a tremendous amount of money for, a 1% ownership interest.
Right.
Well, that's basically doing it so you can say you're a part of it.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't looking to get involved in a nightclub to say I'm a part of a nightclub. I'm looking at it for how can we push money through it?
Yeah.
And if you've got a place that's owned, first of all, you're not going to have no operational control with 1 or 2% ownership interest. Secondly, it only holds 300 people. Well, how much are you going to be able to claim in phantom sales?
Yeah, you're limited to what you can actually write off with
You'd rather have a place that's 1,200 people. Even if they only got 600 or 700 people coming to the nightclub, you can gin up the numbers for the remainder. I had a friend down in Orange County who owned a nightclub, massive trafficker, multiple ton player, and his nightclub hosted the hottest party in Orange County. And for 3 years, all they did was push money through. Now, it was big on Thursday nights. It was, a halfway decent nightclub on Friday and Saturdays. But their big night of the week was Thursday. But that one Thursday night gave them enough credibility where they were able to say, hey, look, we pushed through X number of dollars on Thursday and 2/3 of that on Friday and 2/3 of that on Saturday. And much of that 2/3 was actually drug proceeds coming out of a duffel bag. And so in Los Angeles, the night clubbing is a way to not only surface capital, but much like for the African-American guys in the music context, this is a way for, white guys or like I've known some guys that were Arabic and Iranian, they get involved in a lot of the nightclubs. And for them, it's the same thing, status symbol and an opportunity, of course, to push the money through.
So you denied the opportunity with Depp?
Yeah, no, I just wasn't interested. It was actually, I wouldn't have even gone to the meeting. In all honesty, it was my goofy roommate's idea because for him, he's like, well, let's just go here. What he has. I'm like, this holds 300 fucking people. Like, why are we even talking to this guy?
Well,
like, I'd rather
Johnny Depp.
Well, but see, that's the thing is like, he grew up in that level of wealth.
Yeah.
7,000 square foot house. His father owned a racing team. His father was a prominent doctor. His mom was a concert violinist. It was private airplanes. So for him, he wanted to maintained that facade. That's why he maintained the music industry thing. Whereas for me, I'm a lower middle class kid from West Covina, 50 miles outside of LA. You know, I'm Latino. I know a bunch of Mexicans. I moved to Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was never enamored with hanging out, shooting pool with Stallone or Sean Penn. Like, I've done that, but it's just because I had the table, they wanted to shoot a game. But other than, hey, rack 'em or a nice shot, I'm not engaging in conversations.
Right.
Whereas the guys on the Beverly Hills side, they wanted to, you know, kind of become accepted in that circle. Whereas for me, I just lived there.
Did you hear the story? And we may have talked about this on the phone conversation, but eventually I mentioned that name, Anthony Fox. He was Depp's partner in the Viper Room. And he was suing Depp for saying that he was hiding proceeds from the club. He was basically laundering money himself from the club.
Mm-hmm.
And so a trial date was set. And the day before they were supposed to go to trial, Anthony Fox went missing. To this day, still never been found.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think eventually Depp gave, not sold, but gave his shares of the club to Fox's daughter. Now what happened after that, I'm not really sure. I do think it held the games that was put on by Molly Bloom that was highlighted in that film, Molly's Game. I don't know if you've seen that, but that was much later. But that's just an interesting tidbit that a lot of people just either gloss over or don't even know about, that the day before he was supposed to go to trial, he winds up missing, and nobody really talks about that. And he's still never been found.
You know, the thing about LA is there is not a very pronounced Italian presence.
Right.
The Italians run things out of Las Vegas.
Right.
However, there are vestiges of the Italians owning some very famous establishments. And I don't want to put their names out there, but, you'd be surprised that, there's, places that back in the 50s and 60s were mobbed up. Well, they're still mobbed up.
Yeah.
And so
grow out of it.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And so a place like that where, you had Mickey Cohen in the 20s and then Bugsy Siegel in the 40s and then whoever the hell was running it in the 60s, then all of a sudden it lands into the laps of a movie star. Well, we don't necessarily, here's the thing, you understand. Depp didn't own the building.
Right.
He rented the building. So the ownership is probably controlled by the people who have a history.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? Like there were, a famous nightclub opened in LA in 1994 called Sanctuary, right there in Beverly Hills. Beautiful nightclub. Well, Pamela Anderson and Bret Michaels were nominally the owners.
Right.
But they weren't the people behind it. What normally happens is you take one or two celebrities like that, slap them on the front to give it a veneer of status to draw attention. But basically, they're not having no impact on operating the club.
Right. That's kind of like how Nashville is. Every bar in Nashville has a famous country singer's name on it. Kid Rock's bar, Jason Aldean's bar, Miranda Lambert's bar, but they essentially don't have really anything to do with it. I think somebody was telling me that they get a check cut to them once a year, maybe $250,000 just to use their name. And then now Kid Rock has been known to show up at his bar and sing every now and then because he lives there, or lives close by. But like a lot of them other people, like you don't see them. They don't come to their bar and sit and hang out and you see them walking around. It's just like you said, name value. You slap that name value on them and then that generates the people to be able to give you your write-offs or your sales.
Well, it creates the buzz at the inception.
Right.
Because once it gets going, it's going to last whatever its run's going to be. And so like I used to see, I drank with Bret Michaels plenty of times, whether it be at Bar One, whether it be at Sanctuary, we partied down in Rio once. And so you'd see them guys out at nightclubs, but again, they're just there partying. Right. It's not like they're in the back office. Most money laundering operations are conducted by individuals who aren't involved in the drug trade. Right. Now, the guy down in Orange County who lived up in Santa Monica, he owned a nightclub, but was a massive trafficker. So he's actually in the office. Whereas most of these guys, I'm not suggesting that Bret Michaels was involved in money laundering. He may not have even known who the actual silent partners were. Right. Because that's part of the money laundering technique is called layering, where you're going to create shell company on shell company on shell company in order to insulate who the actual people are.
And is that something you talked one time too about? I think that's why a lot of these places would come open up. They'd be open for 2 years. They'd close up shop and then reopen again and rebrand as something else. What is the reasoning behind that? How does that benefit to the money laundering?
Well, from the money laundering perspective, the trafficker's objective is to launder the money so it can be entered into the financial system by disguising its criminal origin.
Yes.
The money launderer charges a fee for providing that service. So now, if you, as a businessman, when a company goes bankrupt, there are what are called, it accumulates tax loss credits.
Mm-hmm.
So if you buy a company out of bankruptcy, you inherit those tax loss credits. Well, you don't pay taxes on the money until you exhaust all your credits. So if you've got $2 million worth of credits, you buy a bankrupt company with $2 million worth of credits, you launder $2 million tax-free. So now the launderer gets to keep all the money.
Wow. Okay.
So not only are you surfacing the capital, but you're surfacing the capital tax-free through the accumulated tax loss credits. Another way you do that is, and which is why you see a lot of nightclubs opening and closing within a couple, 2-3 years, is because you dump, $500,000 into fixing it up. You inflate the number to $1 million.
Right.
Then over the course of the next 3, 4, 5 years of the lease, you can write the tenant renovations off as depreciation. So the money that you spend on refurbishing it, launder tax-free. The phantom money you spend, launder tax-free. And so what you want to do is, up until you exhaust all your depreciation and tax loss credits, at that point, close it, open it with the new business, and replicate the model. And so every 2-3 years, you have like a 3-year run, shut it down. And then 6 months later, you reopen it up under a different name and a different company. And you just push it right through again.
Jesus. And it's crazy. Like, you think of how many people now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's people legit that are doing this and doing it not for the reasons that we're talking about, but it just seems like you would be able to do this so often in plain sight and nobody be the wiser to it.
Sure. Well, that's why, the law enforcement focuses their attention on interdiction in the international sphere and targeting traffickers. The only time you really see money laundering cases is when somebody gets busted and somebody talks. I mean, these are very difficult investigations.
Right.
And oftentimes they involve individuals with, high levels of education. These are, the guys in Guadalajara, many of them went to USC. Yeah. They're conversing in both. And you're not meeting Chapo.
Yeah.
Some guy from the mountains with a second grade education. Those aren't the individuals that are moving the money. Mm-hmm. And so it's difficult for law enforcement to infiltrate the rings. And it's difficult for the authorities to unravel these cases in a timely period. Like the large money laundering investigations, they'll take 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's an enormous investment in agent time, investigatory time. Now, are those investigations going on? Certainly, but not at the high level of frequency you would expect.
Right.
And so, yes, what you're indicating is that is it possible for people to do this? Look, this is happening routinely in Los Angeles. And quite frankly, now with the whole Chinese thing, if you're a wealthy American who has dollars in the United States, they buy them off you. Like the guy in China has no idea he's buying drug money.
Yeah.
Just like the guy in Brazil who's buying heavy industrial grade equipment in Los Angeles, he doesn't know that the money is drug money. He just knows there's a broker selling dollars.
Yes.
This is common throughout Latin America. It's called cambios. It's common in Chinese culture. It's 1,500-year-old. It's Feishin. So for them, they're like, hey, we got an American who's got 3 million. Okay, yeah, I'll take him. So if you want to make, you could go to a legitimate Asian broker, a money broker from China in Los Angeles and say, hey, I got 3 million. I want 10% of my money. He'd probably give it to you. And you have your money back in 10 days. because they're hitting the Chinese guy for 30%.
Yeah. They're making 20.
The Mexicans are so happy that they're getting their money laundered at 1%. They're not charging the Chinese. If they were actually a little more astute, they'd be charging the Chinese to access their dollars. But it's such an enormous windfall for the Mexicans, because now they're making 10% extra on their shipments. It's just a windfall for them. So they're like, hey, just give the Chinese the money. So the Chinese are laundering the money for the Mexicans for essentially free. The Mexicans are giving the money to the Chinese essentially for free. Suddenly, the American law enforcement community cannot infiltrate an operation where nobody's profiting. All the profits and all the layering and all the laundering and all the surfacing are happening in China, where the American Department of Treasury has no ability to monitor.
Mm-hmm.
So long as all the banking happens in China and you're using burner phones in LA, like they had one case where the Mexican guy got followed and he met the Chinese guy.
Yeah.
So like they grab him. So obviously what the Mexicans are going to have to start doing is just start hiring a bunch of white guys, meet the courier, and then they go meet with the Chinese guys. You know what I mean? Like the law enforcement's on the lookout. Look for any Mexicans meeting Chinese.
Yeah.
You know, like one guy crashed into an undercover car. They found $500,000 in the car. I mean, that's how they're stumbling onto these investigations. There are literally dozens of cells operating throughout the United States, and we have no idea. The American government has no idea who they are.
Does cryptocurrency play into any of this, or has it become a bigger factor? I mean, I know like this has kind of became a bigger thing since you've done your stint in prison. Now you're out. I'm sure you know what it is and kind of its background. I mean, it kind of got popular on the dark web. I don't know if you've read that story about, was it the Dread Pirate Roberts or whatever his name was?
Yeah,
Ross William Albright.
Yeah, I met him in custody.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, 2011. I was back in court when he got knocked off.
Okay. So you met him. Is cryptocurrency becoming a thing that is being a part of this? Is it still kind of, shied away from? Where is it landing all this?
From my understanding, not so much.
Okay.
Only because on the small level, the Mickey Mouse operator, of course, these are the guys that are essentially using the limos today. That's the equivalent. Yes. But the big operators, no, because it's not necessary when you already have foolproof methods. You know, the Chinese have taken over 75% of money laundering. The Mexicans are keeping the other 25 just as diversification and to keep that capacity in-house, because those are the people that are managing the money, because now the money's entering into the system through legitimate commerce from China. And so, when one of the new generation guys just got knocked off, it was one of the financial individuals got caught in Uruguay. Uruguay is an enormous money laundering haven in the Western Hemisphere. Well, he gets apprehended, sent to the United States, and during the course of his prosecution, it becomes known that he oversaw a portfolio of 2,000 shell companies. So his job is simply moving money between companies. So they want to keep that expertise. You don't need to introduce cryptocurrencies. Now, there has been some cases where stable coins have been used. Okay. Stable coins aren't necessarily it's a form of crypto, but it's tethered to the US dollar. So it's the equivalent of dollar. So it's essentially an IOU. And so there's some use of stable coins, but not at scale. When you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a month, it's simply not, the liquidity isn't available to be able to conduct transactions without attracting attention.
Yeah, and it's not very safe as far as that. There's all kinds of stories about where people had, exorbitant amounts of money in there, and they just a hacker, some 16-year-old kid knows how to go in there and just take it from you, and there's essentially not shit you can do about it. So I get the logic in that. If you've got a foolproof method that's working, there's really no reason to go away from it. Like I said, that was kind of birthed more on the dark web side of things. You, before we close out, you sent me a graphic that kind of had some arrows detailing how how the money flows and in everywhere that it
yes,
goes
well,
to?
In order for your audience to kind of appreciate how money laundering operates in the United States, I wanted to demonstrate that, LA is the epicenter for money laundering, and it has been for decades. And although there are numerous methods to get product into the United States, like Los Angeles is the principal importation hub for both the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels. Mm-hmm. And from Los Angeles, the product goes up to the Pacific Northwest, east throughout the rest of the United States. But you'll notice on that map, the money only flows in one direction. Always goes back to Southern California. Mm-hmm. And that's the linchpin, because Los Angeles and Guadalajara are sister cities. There are hundreds of thousands of Mexicans from Jalisco living in LA proper. And so every Mexican in LA has a cousin in Jalisco. Every Mexican, I mean? It's that kind of ties between the communities. And so there's a general movement where you have family bonds. Your mom is the aunt in Guadalajara. His mom's the aunt in LA, the cousins. That's how the in-house operation worked for decades. Mm-hmm. The Chinese have essentially made all of that redundant. I'm not saying it's gone away entirely, because you never put all your eggs in one basket. So I'm sure, the guys in Mexico are keeping it for diversification purposes, allowing those structures to exist. But the volume of money going through has plummeted. So now LA is still the money laundering operation, capital, but it's the Chinese money laundering operation capital. Because like I said, we have 4 triads operating in LA, 3 large, Asian Chinese communities. And you've had, particularly since I was in prison, an enormous influx of wealth. Out by where I grew up was predominantly Hispanic when I was in high school and as a young man. There are entire pockets that are now Chinese. Arcadia, San Marino, much of Rosemead, much of Temple City. These are all towns that have now been bought up. And what you see happening are Chinese nationals buying property in LA, but not coming to Los Angeles. These are investments, or in case the shit ever hits the fan in China, it's their parachute.
Yeah, it's their asylum.
You see what I'm saying? And so they've bought up so much property in Southern California that it's created an issue where it's priced a lot of individuals, particularly out of what was previously lower middle class communities. Mm-hmm. You can't buy a house in West Covina now for under $700,000, which is, insane compared to when we moved there, or when I was growing up. And so you see the impact of all this Chinese capital coming into Southern California. And so given the long tradition of triad presence, in conjunction with a large diaspora that provides cover. I'm not trying to imply that every Chinese individual, of course, is involved. They're not. But those individuals who are able to hide within the broader community. Mm-hmm. Which is why LA has always been the drug trafficking capital of the United States, because LA is a predominantly Mexican city. There's more Mexican Americans than any other demographic. And so, again, I'm not trying to imply that they're all involved, but those who are involved can easily maneuver. There's no surprise having a new Mexican restaurant pop up in your town.
Yeah.
Whereas in other cities, it'd be noticeable.
Interesting stuff, man. Is there anything else you want to hit before we wrap this up? I mean, I think we've got
I appreciate you inviting me back. I know that people are always very interested in money laundering. And, the last point I would like to make is, the big money, of course, is on the Chinese end, where the Chinese triad members are taxing the wealthy Chinese, 30%. Mm-hmm. From the Mexicans' perspective, they're getting their money back, not in the form of pesos. What they're getting is Chinese goods. So that rich guy deposits the 4 million into an account. The Triad keeps his million. They go buy 3 million worth of, like I said, laptops, cell phones, sneakers, and they sell that to China. They ship the cargo to Mexico. Well, that's also the mechanism in which they use to ship the precursors. Because now today, the majority of the money being generated in Mexico are coming from synthetic compounds. Whereas before, whether you're talking in the opium context, whether you're talking in the blow context, whether you're talking in the weed context, these are all agricultural products. They require a lot of land. They require a lot of farm workers, field workers, fertilizer. None of that is in play with synthetics. So the profits have grown astronomically, but what they need are a continuous supply of precursors. Well, China is the world's largest producer of chemicals.
Yeah.
Now, China isn't sending Mexico the precursors. The Mexicans are buying what are called pre-precursors. Well, a pre-precursor is otherwise known as something totally legal. And so they're taking the money into Chinese bank accounts, creating all these shell companies. And a Chinese shell company will go to a Chinese chemical company and say, hey, we need 16 tons of this. And we're sending it to Malaysia. And then they send it to Malaysia. And their Triad buddy in Malaysia, predominantly Chinese population in Malaysia, send it to their Triad buddy in Indonesia, largest demographic in Indonesia, Chinese. Then they send it from there to Guatemala or to Panama. Then it comes in. You know what I mean? And so the same system that is being used to launder the money for the Mexicans at cut rate prices is also the same system that's unfortunately fueling the synthetic epidemic, which, like we discussed earlier, has fundamentally changed, the drug markets in the United States.
Wow. You break it down very well, because I think that's just a piece of the pie that's always kind of glossed over in all your movies and even TV series to some extent. You see them making it, you see the product getting from A to B, you see the struggles of, the smuggling and everything, but the money laundering, which is a huge important part and a key factor of, being able to keep that money and having access to it, is oftentimes glossed over in some of these movies. They don't give you, at least not, to the extent of what you just explained here in this interview. So I definitely appreciate you coming on and kind of breaking that down for us. And I'm sure we'll have you back later on. We'll cover some more, because I really, really do get a kick out of all those stuff, and the listeners seem to love it as well.
No problem. Well, thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, that'll do it for this episode. Pete, I'm sure we'll see you again, my friend. Until next time, have a good one, buddy.